Welcome everyone to the Ohio Peace and Conflict Studies Network and the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflicts Peace and Conflict Education webinar series. We're really excited that today we have Dr. Paul Morrow from the University of Dayton who will talk about the role of dialogue in peace and conflict studies. This is actually a series that here in Ohio, we have, in the United States, we have over 24 colleges and universities that have peace or conflict studies programs, concentrations, or degrees. And they've come together to support each other through professional development, resource sharing, student programming, and more. So hopefully you'll be able to check out the Ohio Peace and Conflict Studies Network's webpage, where the prior webinars are archived and where you can register for future webinars. I'll share with you a little bit about GPPAC. So GPPAC is the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict, and we have hundreds of civil society organizations working on peace building around the globe in the 15 world regions. There is a peace education working group of which myself and this network is a part, and it is made up of representatives from the 15 world regions who are working at scale to build capacity in their countries and regions around peace or conflict education. And so that could be in primary, secondary schools, colleges and universities, and in the community in a variety of capacities. And so we're really thankful for GPPAC's sponsorship of this event. My name is Jennifer Batten, and I'm the co-chair of the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflicts working group on peace education. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Paul Morrow, who will share his presentation with us. Following that, we'll have a time for questions and answers. One of the things we do ask is if you could please keep your phones, your computers on mute until it's time for questions and answers, and then we'll take those. This session is recorded and will be archived on the Ohio Peace and Conflict Studies Network's webinar page. So thank you so much, Dr. Morrow, for joining us, and please go ahead and share your screen. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. I think I need to wait for you to finish. Yeah. Perfect. And welcome, everyone. Thank you for being part of this dialogue. I need my PowerPoint to come up. I hope this will be a bit of a dialogue. I'm going to give a presentation that might last about 30 minutes or so, maybe a bit less, talking through not so much the goals of dialogue in a sort of theoretical way, but specifically how to incorporate dialogue into courses of study, particularly at a university level, but there'll also be discussion about high schoolers, and I'm happy to talk a bit about primary education as well and where dialogue might fit in there. I have some acknowledgements at the end, but first let me say thank you to Jen and thank you to the Global Partnership, as well as to my colleagues here at UD for allowing me to do dialogue work. So very briefly, I'll start by talking about three different kinds of dialogue. Intergroup dialogue is very commonly used in organizations from business to universities to civil society groups and government to try to talk specifically about the positionality of different members of those organizations. And this form of dialogue often extends over a period of time from 4 to 8 to even more weeks. So it's a very sustained form of dialogue where the goal is to establish trust early on in order to make possible conversations about features of one's identity or positionality that are difficult to talk about in a sort of short-term fashion. This is one form of dialogue that's currently active at my university. Second, interfaith dialogue. This is a kind of dialogue that we did quite a bit in my previous role in the Netherlands in a group called Utrecht Dialogue. And the image that you see there is from a iftar dinner and dialogue that we had on the UN Day of Cultural Diversity last year at one of the theaters in a heavily immigrant part of Utrecht, which is the town I was living in. Also focuses on people's identity, but specifically talking across religious lines. And a lot of dialogue organizations, both in the United States and in Europe, got started in trying to address interreligious conflict. And a more flexible form of dialogue, which is the one that I really have done the most training in, is not so much about any specific topic, but a methodology for talking about all sorts of topics, appreciative inquiry. This is particularly popular in business and government groups because one of the sort of founding principles of this is to try to get people to focus first on their experiences, and second, to try to orient the dialogue towards some form of action, a step one can take to change one situation. It's called appreciative inquiry because the goal is to have participants really listen with respect and an open mind and without just waiting to add their own input to the experiences of others. So appreciation in that sense. It's also sometimes referred to as affirmative dialogue. So in thinking about how dialogue of one of these several kinds, and that there's a list that could have gone on for several slides, but I've only mentioned 3 specific kinds, how it can be incorporated into a course of study like peace and conflict studies, philosophy, my own home discipline. There are some definite differences between the way traditional higher education is structured and oriented and the way that dialogue is typically presented. So dialogue in any of these forms is generally experience-driven rather than theory-driven. The goal is not to have someone with a claim to specialized knowledge share that knowledge with the group, but rather to have everyone who has an experience with a relevant problem, subject, or aspiration share that experience. On a similar vein, dialogue, unlike traditional higher education, is supposed to be quite egalitarian. And that's one of the challenges we've had in thinking about how to incorporate on campus specifically dialogue into the programming, both for students and for faculty, is how do you erode those hierarchies of knowledge, professionalism that typically would prevent a professor sitting at a table with a bunch of students from actually sharing on an egalitarian basis their experience instead of using it as a sort of teachable moment. And finally, there are some, David Bohm particularly in his book on dialogue, who say that a structural feature of dialogues, unlike a course or a business corporation's projects, is that it should be completely open-ended, that somehow it interferes with the goal of dialogue or the purpose of dialogue to set out a list of objectives for what the dialogue is supposed to accomplish. And that's quite different from a traditional academic orientation where either in a course or in a program, you have goals, you have objectives, you have a syllabus for what you want to accomplish. So I think that there are 2 basic models for incorporating dialogue into peace and conflict studies, but also other educational courses of study. One is relatively low resource requiring, and it serves one of the important goals of dialogue, which is to expand the pool of knowledge and experiences that our students are exposed to. So on the left-hand side of the screen, I'm focusing on my experience with the organization Utrecht and Dialogue, which partnered with both University College Utrecht, which was the international school in that city, and Utrecht University, which is the mainly Dutch language and teaching school in that city, to run dialogues on various kinds of topics, from the relationship between town and gown or students and non-academic residents of the city, to women's suffrage and the European elections last year. And this allows universities to engage their students with members of the community that they wouldn't otherwise meet without building a lot of resources into dialogue. And it also has advantages for those community partner groups. So Utrecht and Dialogue particularly is working with some master's students at Utrecht University to try to measure, to quantify the impact of their work. So the relationship goes both ways in terms of who benefits from this kind of partnership. Here in Dayton, our Human Rights Center has partnered with local institutions like the Human Relations Council, which was doing dialogue work before I arrived here, and also the International Peace Museum, to host dialogues, to advertise, communicate about dialogues, and to brainstorm possible necessary topics for dialogue. I'll share briefly about one of those topics towards the end of this presentation. The second model is to institutionalize dialogue on campus. And this is usually done in the form of a center for dialogue, a dialogue zone, or a certain kind of institute. I'm not sure how common my own institution, University of Dayton's model is, but they have created a dialogue zone in their remodeled library, which is a room that's fairly modular, flexible, holds about 25 or 30 folks. And they use that space to host dialogues on all sorts of topics that are advertised across campus. And increasingly, professors themselves can bring their class in to engage in dialogue as part of a course assignment. One feature I like about the space particularly is it has sort of governing principles or norms for dialogue actually painted on the wall. So you can see compassion, respect, understanding, and they incorporate that into the initial sort of guidelines that they give at the start of these dialogues. So whichever route that one takes, the partnership route working with area organizations or institutionalizing dialogue on campus, I think it's helpful to think about the several different ways that students, whether they're studying peace and conflict studies or just taking a course in that field, can learn about dialogue, can learn through dialogue, and can learn for dialogue. And I'm modeling this on the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights Education and Training, which uses that same threefold structure to talk about how human rights education should be conducted. So first, education about dialogue. Here at Dayton, communications students in one of the required communications classes, they learn about dialogue as one of several different ways in which people relate to each other. So they learn about it as a skill. They can also learn about it as a method, and that involves a bit of a deeper dive into how do you actually structure particular forms of dialogue, so students have the opportunities to engage in those intergroup or interfaith dialogues I was mentioning. And as a vocation, because we're a religious university, people are here encouraged to think about their vocation religiously as well as academically, and dialogue work is conducted frequently by members of the clergy staff of the university as well as the academic staff. Education through dialogue involves using the technique of facilitating, organizing, or leading dialogues as part of students' educational work. And that can happen in the normal classroom, so professors can ask their students to organize dialogues as part of a course, or perhaps as a capstone project, or it can happen extracurricularly. And so an example that we used here, an example that was conducted here at Dayton last fall was through a partnership with the Four Cities Youth Leadership Alliance, which is an organization that brought students from 3 different cities in Bosnia and Herzegovina to Dayton, which was the 4th city, to learn about various kinds of civic leadership, civil society work being done here that then they could try to take back to their respective cities in that country. And we were one of several stops for their visit, and they spent a whole day workshopping with us various kinds of techniques for partnering and doing community engagement, including dialogue. So you see in these pictures, one of our students working with students from this visiting group in the dialogue zone, and then the other pictures, that entire group. So we had about full capacity for the space that we have. Roughly 20, 25 students were involved in this. And it was educational for the students who were visiting here, who were high school students, but I think it was equally educational for our college undergraduate students who took part in facilitating these dialogues and got to learn about people with very different set of experiences from their own. Finally, there's education for dialogue. So we think a lot about career development, particularly I work in the Human Rights Center here. So different folks in different kinds of departments and programs, peace and conflict studies, peace studies, a lot of thought goes into what is the professional development, what is the career path coming out of these degrees. So we think that dialogue work can be something that people take directly into their career. It can lead them on to graduate education, or it can lead them to various forms of civic engagement once they're further along in their career, maybe 10 or 15 years out from their undergraduate degree. And a good example of the last point, we had sadly a mass shooting in Dayton in August of last year, just before I arrived. And one of my tasks was to use our Endowment for Education and Nonviolence to try to put together an event where we could talk about the problem of gun violence, both locally and nationally. And so what we did was we hosted beginning of this month, a community forum on gun violence in Dayton and the US, which featured the mayor of Dayton, it featured a local state senator, it featured the chief of police, as well as members of the Community Police Council, Racial Justice Now, and other organizations. And although I don't have a good picture of the entire group engaging in the most dialogue-like process, many, many members of that roundtable were graduates of the University of Dayton who've gone on to civic work in various kinds. I think that this kind of event shows the range of what can be described as dialogue. So the on-the-ground working with students in a classroom over the course of a semester and a one-off sort of civic event like this. Both can be described as dialogue. It's a very capacious term, and it's popular, I think, especially in civic settings like this, because it's a relatively low resource requiring form of engaging a topic of public interest. So I think there are advantages and disadvantages to that feature of it, but I think there's often an appetite to engage in dialogue as one of the easier ways for public figures to show their attention to a particularly contentious issue. So if you want to get involved in dialogue work and you haven't been doing it before, I think many people watching this webinar are already in that world, but here's a sort of notional timeline you can use with students who want to get involved. First step is frequently to attend a dialogue of some form. Second step is to participate in a training for how one would facilitate a dialogue. So again, because of the egalitarian nature of the form of dialogue I trained in, we don't talk about people leading dialogues, but we talk about them facilitating, which is making sure that folks stay on topic, follow the ground rules about respect, communication, and frankly, just keeping things on time. The third step then is to do that facilitation work, maybe over time. Planning a dialogue, so picking a theme, picking a location, doing the partnering work. It involves a different set of skills in some ways than actually facilitating in the moment. And then finally, spreading the work of dialogue to others by training others to do this sort of work. And that's what we did several times last semester, and we're going to continue doing here in order to build capacity for the dialogue zone on campus. So I want to leave a lot of time for questions because there's a lot more to be said about dialogue. I will briefly show a short bibliography on dialogue, so if folks want to do more of the academic background work on how dialogue relates to peace and conflict settings particularly. Here are some resources that I found helpful. And I want to acknowledge the different organizations that both I use the content for that have sponsored dialogue work here in Dayton and in the Netherlands, and also made this webinar possible. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to discuss further.
Thanks so much, Dr. Morrow. And if you wouldn't mind going back to the slide of the resources,
sure.
While we take questions, that would be great, just in case. And thanks for the lovely acknowledgements. We appreciate that. So Dr. Morrow's open for questions now. We only have about 10 participants. So what we could do is, if you want to unmute your microphone, if you have a question. It looks like maybe Anna has her mic unmuted. I'm not sure if you have a question, but if one of you would like to begin, we'll go ahead and take questions one at a time. Thanks. Does anyone have a question? Shuyan or Robin or Peter or Layla? Any questions? Or Kathleen or Emma? I think Emma's with the Sustained Dialogue Campus Network. Maybe she could share.
Hi, this is Robin. I do have a question, if that's okay.
Sure. Hello.
Great. So just to locate myself, I'm a professor in conflict resolution and ethnic studies at Nova Southeastern University. And we do host, and I share in facilitating dialogue processes around diversity and inclusion topics on campus. But my question is around a grant project that I'm involved in developing along with one of the other participants from NSU here online, Peter Kent. And what we're planning to do is conduct some dialogues with active duty service members and veterans around the experience of war. And this is associated with a grant from the National Endowment from the Humanities on dialogue on the experience of war. And building into our process, one of the things we want to do, given limited time constraints, is at the beginning of the session itself, the sessions themselves, provide a brief overview of dialogue processes. And I'm wondering, from your experience, what suggestions you might have about how in a limited amount of time to share just a few key points about the dialogue process itself when you're not in that academic context of having a whole class session to cover that material. So just wondering what the thoughts from our presenter or others in the group about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. I'll try to share my thoughts first. I'm happy to hear others because first, we have done some work with veterans on dialogue. So I'm part of a project called the Vietnam Legacies Project, and we did a dialogue with Vietnam veterans and some of our students there. A different setting, I think, entirely than a dialogue specifically amongst veterans. And there were, in fact, cases where some of the veterans who were there didn't want to participate in a dialogue with students who didn't have that sort of background. We didn't have an extensive discussion of the sort of theory of dialogue or the different models, but what I can imagine working well is to provide specific examples of types of dialogues, which I didn't do in great detail here. So Ubuntu dialogues, for example, or dialogues that involve the use of a talking stick, for example, as a way of illustrating the different models for how a dialogue could work and the different norms for how one participates in it before narrowing in on the specific structure that you want to use for your dialogue.
Thanks. Are there others that would like to share your, Robin thanks you in the comments there, Paul. Are there other ideas for Robin of resources that one might use from those on the call? Just make sure you unmute your mic. I think, Robin, from one of the things that we did at Cuyahoga Community College and in a number of colleges and universities across Ohio was a process by the Sustained Dialogue Institute called the Sustained Dialogue Campus Network, which is amazing. And one of the things that I find that might be really helpful is a lot of people don't understand the difference between dialogue, debate, and discussion. Yes. And so even having some simple form, like a one-pager that shares the differences could be really helpful for those who may not have participated in a dialogue or think they have, because so many people misuse the term dialogue, and that's not really what's happening. So that might be helpful as well. I've seen some online, and the Sustained Dialogue Campus Network has some good resources too on their webpage. And I think the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation, for those of you who are on the call, that's a wonderful resource. And a lot of their materials are available for free online. So again, that's the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation.
And I have one other resource to share, if I may. I'm going to start my video just to show it. So the form of dialogue that we use, we do have a kind of resource present on the table in front of every person. I'm sorry for the relatively poor way of transmitting this, but hopefully you can see it. And so this lays out in a visual manner, in a sustained manner over the course of the conversation, some of the principles of dialogue and some of the stages of dialogue in our model. So I do think having a kind of sustained visual aid of that kind can be helpful. And it could be textual, or it could be visual, or both.
Were you sharing that, Paul? I'm not sure we see it. I'm sorry, I missed it.
I'm sorry, I had turned on my camera. Okay. Did it not work?
So I think you need to maybe stop sharing, and then you could reshare whatever your new screen is. You can select it. Yeah.
Well, all I had done was start the video function on the Zoom. So I didn't have a new share. I was just holding it up literally to the camera.
I saw it.
Okay, great. You saw it. Great. Okay, good.
As I said, sorry for the primitive form of showing that. I could have included it in the PowerPoint, but I didn't. I'd be happy to share with anyone afterwards if they want that resource to pass that along.
Wonderful. What other questions? I know Persian's joining us from Iraq. We have Divine's on, Emma Lovejoy's on, Peter I think is at Nova Southeastern University, Robin mentioned, and they're working together on their dialogue grant. Veterans, great. Crystal or Shuyan, Alethea or Layla, questions? You would just unmute your button there.
This is Alicia. I actually want to thank Robin for actually inviting us in the same program that she mentioned we're all in, or at least me and Pete. And so I was interested. I had seen a documentary on the Fuyao glass company that opened at the location where the General Motors manufacturer was at, and they discussed and demonstrated merging two different cultures, so the Chinese culture and the American culture, and how they tried to merge the two cultures to work together to manufacture glass. And they demonstrated the differences within the dialogue between the Americans and the Chinese. And I was really intrigued by how dialogue, if it was in fact in place, and if they were interested in wanting to create a healthier environment for the two cultures in that company, and did they seek out, dialogue assistance? Because I know that incorporating the union was a big thing for those that were advocating for unionizing the company. And then from what I understand, the chairman was informing the American people that if, at least the leaders and them that he had hired to run the company, that if the union were to get involved, that he would pull out. So then there was this big vote, and it ended up not becoming unionized due to the younger population of the employees were fearful of not having jobs. So I wanted to know if you knew any insight on whether or not that company sought out any sort of assistance in that cultural merging.
So I'll speak very briefly because I don't have direct knowledge of the context at the time that merger happened. I came to Dayton this year. I have seen the documentary you mentioned, and there's organizations that are featured in that documentary who could describe their work as dialogue work, right? So there are folks who are doing cultural sensitivity training for the Chinese workers, for example, who were documented making quite generalizing statements about the American workers. I imagine a similar training happened the other direction, though I don't remember if that was shown on screen. And then there was discussion of the disadvantages of unionization by a private corporation that was brought in order to educate workers about that. And there was some discussion of how, while they're on the clock, they can't listen to pro-unionization groups. What I would say is that that's the sort of piece of how you could start a dialogue that we do quite often here at the university, and that also we did in the Netherlands as well, using a kind of cultural product, whether it's a documentary, a text, a talk by a visiting speaker, that starts a conversation and then continuing the conversation in the form of dialogue. So it's actually a great suggestion to incorporate that into either our in-classroom or extracurricular sort of programming, and not only on campus, but also within the wider community. But as far as I know, there have not been dialogue initiatives around that particular merger here. Thank you.
This is Kathleen Knight-Abowitz. I work at Miami University, and I missed the first part of this. I came in late, so I'm sorry. But I have an undergraduate student who's working on trying to think about applications of dialogue and peace studies to something related to what we were just talking about, which is the growing number of Chinese international undergraduates in American universities, and thinking about peace education approaches to better integrate and bridge cultural divides on campuses like ours, where we have seen a very big upswing in particularly Chinese undergraduates here. So I just wanted to put that out there and see if anybody has any references or just any ideas about resources for that kind of application.
So thank you so much, Kathleen. So opening that up to the group that's on the call, any thoughts or recommendations for Miami University?
So let me speak briefly again. My experience in the Netherlands was often with folks who had transplanted themselves from elsewhere in Europe or from the United States, English-speaking residents of the Netherlands who didn't necessarily speak Dutch. And
Right.
one of the tasks for any dialogue that's going to successfully bridge those sort of cultural divides is making sure the language skills are present in the room to do that sort of translation work where it's necessary. As a graduate of Miami University myself, I'm sure that there are many very excellent English-speaking Chinese visiting students there, and there may be others who don't feel as comfortable sitting in a room for 2 hours with other folks speaking just in English. So one thing one can do is try to locate students who are willing to be sort of cultural or linguistic, really, navigators who can help with some of those barriers to accessibility. But I think it's a great, actually, initiative for trying to build that understanding. It does take time, and students are often heavily subscribed. So in the Netherlands, when we did things on campus, there was always a challenge of finding a window in the day when a lot of students would be available, and then using food or some other potluck afterwards, for example, some other attraction for folks to come and sit in a room with each other for 2 hours that wasn't part of their coursework.
Right. Yeah, that's the hard part.
And Kathleen, actually, I'm also, this is Jen Batten. I did my undergrad at Miami. You have a lot of Miamians.
Nice.
So I think one of the resources that a number of our colleges and universities here in Ohio use, but it's across the United States and do great work. And I think Emma might still be on. I think that Emma who's on is with Sustained Dialogue, or used to be. I might be mistaken. So maybe she can answer a few of your questions. But they have a wonderful program that we've had it's been at Cleveland State University. It's still at Case Western Reserve University. It's at Cogga Community College. Ohio State University used it. But it's called the Sustained Dialogue Campus Network. And I think if you could take a look at that model was, it's also one that I used at 3 of our campuses at Cogga Community College to bring together international and domestic students that worked really well for looking at change. And so it's a longer term model than a lot of the dialogue processes, which are what I would call one-off discussion. You know, they're one-off dialogues.
Right.
This occurs more along the semester. And so I have pulled up, I think everyone can see the Sustained Dialogue Campus Network's Sustained Dialogue page. And let's see about if I can find the model on their webpage. So let's see. So they look at, it focuses on relationships, looking at identity, interests, power, perceptions, and patterns of interaction with relationship. And then over a period of time, you bring together, normally it's a group of 8 to 12 students will work together over the course of a year, entire year. But at Cogga Community College, it was the semester. So you bring together key stakeholders that represent key constituents. They look at what is the challenge that they think is occurring, and then do a deep root cause analysis of the why. And then they bring together key stakeholders to think about, how do we address that? What's already happening? And so that could be people from outside the dialogue group, and then implement that, whatever that plan is. So that might be of interest based on what you were talking about. And you could also, when we're off of this, I can provide my email address, and I can connect you with some of the other colleges and universities, or you could reach out directly to the Sustained Dialogue Institute, and they could give you some great resources and ideas.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Are there others on the call who would like to weigh in on what Kathleen mentioned from Miami?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Morrow. My name is Divine. Divine Mongery. I'm calling you all the way from Maryland, College Park. Thank you for your presentation, but also thanks to Dr. Cooper who invited us. It's been interesting. I'm pleased to know that you have a background in philosophy. I do the same, and in theology as well. And it seems to me you're doing a great job there at Dayton. My question for you is, is that, do you know, I mean, would you mind sharing with me if you know other places, other opportunities that I could take advantage of as I'm hoping to graduate sometimes in June this year. I'm a student at Nova Southeastern University working with Dr. Cooper. And I did my research on the conflict in Cameroon, looking at it from a Christian perspective, more or less. So I was just wondering, I mean, like if you know other places I could apply to, I'm hoping to be employed by my church, which is based in Cameroon. But I just thought that I tell you and others who attended, just if you know other places, other opportunities one could apply to.
Yeah, I empathize entirely because I'm also on the job market at the moment. My position here is a sort of a one-off postdoc. I think that my impression is that with dialogue work, you have to be a lot more creative than the sort of traditional higher ed job market, which I'm not sure that I am a good example of successfully navigating. I just happened to find a higher ed position that included dialogue, and there was an initiative at the university to do dialogue work, so that was very helpful. A lot of my partner organizations are civic groups, so cities and other broader sort of county level community groups, which sometimes do hiring for people to do dialogue work, often in the context of specific kinds of contested relationships. So here in Dayton, the Human Relations Council has a specific office for community police relations, and that was set up in response to perceived tensions or a crisis in those relationships. And they brought on someone to do sustained dialogue work there. The previous position that I had in doing dialogue work was entirely a volunteer-based organization, so it was not paid. I think that that's both an advantage and a disadvantage. I was thinking of this with Kathleen's question as well. If you have academic spouses or people who aren't directly working at a university, doing dialogue work can be a helpful way of actually getting to know the community that you're living in. That's how I found it to be in the Netherlands when I was in that position. But I'm afraid I don't have any direct leads for you. Maybe other folks will share either in the chat or in conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Other questions? And then I thought I might share a couple of resources related to our discussion today. Any other questions from anyone who hasn't had an opportunity yet? Maybe Crystal or Xian or others? Okay. So here is one of the web pages that I mentioned. That this is the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation. This is a great resource if you're looking for free materials. Go right here to resources, and you'll find where you can add if you've had a resource that you're using at your institution and would be willing to share it. They have a beginner's guide to dialogue right here. There's a Resource Center homepage. I'm going to just go there for a moment so you can take a look at what great. They also have a Facebook page if you're on Facebook, and you can take a look. Sometimes they post jobs. Divine, you mentioned about jobs, and so I would take a look and maybe join their Facebook. Here's some of the different resources with beginner's guides and some of the latest resources that are added here that you can see. They also have an annual conference. I think it's annual, maybe it's every 2 years, but you could take a look at their events as well, and that might be a good resource for many of you. Is anyone that's on the call a member of the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation and would like to share more? Or has maybe attended one of their conferences?
I have. This is Kathleen in Oxford, Ohio, and it's such a great conference. I've only been to one, but I can highly recommend their meetings. They're really useful. They happen every other year, and they're very good. They are such a nice mix of people who are doing research and people who are practicing. It's a nice mix.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
Others that are on the call that have maybe participated? I have to say that I've used, if you can see over here on the right-hand side, they have 3,165 resources. So it can be a little overwhelming when you start in there, but I know that I've used some of those materials when working on curriculum for the state of Minnesota's Bureau of Mediation Services. So they have some great resources here, and hopefully you'll check them out. And if you're here in the US, maybe consider participating in one of their conferences. I did want to also show you here, for those of you who are interested, we have, this is the Ohio Peace and Conflict Studies Network's webpage. And while we are to support the colleges and universities here in Ohio, many of those ways that we're supporting each other can also benefit other colleges and universities throughout the US and beyond, such as these webinars. So if you click on resources here on the right-hand side and OPCSN webinars, you can see some of the resources here, and we'll click on the webinars. These are some of them that are coming up. And what we've asked is each of our colleges and universities that are partners to share with us something that's their expertise, or their something that they're known for, the work that they're doing, such as University of Dayton. So Paul has been so gracious in sharing with us his experience with dialogue. So you can see some of the different opportunities there, because we do have, for instance, coming up something related, which is the Community Mediation Centers, which is coming up in March of 2020, which is expanding opportunities for colleges and communities. So Oberlin College has one of the oldest dialogue and mediation centers in the United States, based at a university. Great. And they'll be joining us to present that segment along with the National Association for Community Mediation. So you might want to join us for that. I wanted to point that out. And you can actually go up here to the resources, click on the webinars, and you'll be able to see the full list. So for past webinars, we do archive. So here's one on conflict resolution models for student conduct. So Denison University has in their Office of Student Conduct, it actually is focused in conflict resolution and restorative practices. So you can come here, see the summary from Denison. I'm sort of scrolling down here, see who presented that. And then you can click here for the recorded webinar. And so those are posted on YouTube. And for instance, for this particular webinar, it will be edited by GPPAC, and then you'll be able to go to this and watch the webinar. So I wanted to share that resource with you. Are there other questions or comments for Paul or Robin, who shared with us, or at Nova Southeastern University, or maybe at Miami University for Kathleen, or Divine with his work in Maryland?
I'll just say that I had not heard of this particular resource before, and this looks really engaging. I can't wait to check it out. There's a lot here that I'm seeing, and I could likely use this in both work and school activities. So thank you for sharing.
Thanks so much.
Same with me. I have the same impressions, so I'm really thankful. I mean, especially with the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation. I'll check it out, but also check on what you've been doing. I mean, do some more research. And also, I'm pleased to know that Dr. Cooper has something coming up. I'll be checking on that as well. So it's great.
Great, thank you so much. We're glad. That's why we're hosting these and asking our colleagues to volunteer their time to offer one of these. So for those of you who are here in Ohio, we would love for you to offer a webinar for us. So maybe Kathleen, either before or after you've done the work that you're going to be doing there at Miami University, we'd love for you to share some of your good work as well in a webinar.
Well, thanks. It's good to have been here today and learn about what's going on and learn from you guys. So thank you very much. And Shuyan, who is the student that I'm working with, is also on the call. So we've both gotten a lot out of it, and we'll be meeting soon to discuss. So thank you for this learning opportunity.
And Kathleen and Shuyan, I will try to put you in touch with the student we have. Her first name is Umaya, who runs a group called Middle Ground, which is a student-run dialogue organization here at UD. And maybe she could share a bit of her experiences organizing that group. They have a different model from some of the dialogues I've done, but also do some of the work of intergroup dialogue that it sounds like you're interested in.
Oh, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else here before we close? Paul?
Well, I want to say thank you to you, Jen, for sharing, non sort of text-based bibliography resources, but actually much more usable resources with the two organizations that you shared with. I look forward to looking at their work. I know there are some European-based dialogue organizations. There was a big conference in the UK last fall. I can't remember the name of that organization at the moment, but I'm very much still learning in this space. I really appreciate you supporting the webinar and everyone's helpful comments about these resources.
Great, thank you so much. So in closing, thank you very much, Dr. Morrow, for sharing your experience. Thanks for joining us, all of the participants, and for sharing your experience and some of the projects you're working on. We hope you'll join us for our next webinar, and those will be posted on Facebook, or you can also go to the Ohio Peace and Conflict Studies Network page and check out the upcoming webinars. So thank you so much and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.